Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to another Founder and Friends. Today, I'm joined by my good friend Paul Stovell, the co-founder and CEO of Octopus Deploy. I feel like it's a product that very few people are going to need me to explain what it does, but it helps developers take their code to production and do it in a reliable way. It is a product we use here at Raygun. We love it every day. So welcome, Paul. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, JD. Nice to be here.
Excellent. Hey, so I want to cover today a few things with our audience because you and I are both developers first who then have gone and built businesses. And you've built a very successful business. And I think there's a lot of gold we could share with people today about how you went about that process, as well as what changes were needed in the mindset between being an engineer through to a business leader. And so, first off, a lot of people I know when I talk to developers, they often think that they're waiting on that one good idea. What's the thing that's going to just go for it? When did you first get the sense that the world needed a deployment tool?
That's a good question. Well, you and I kind of collaborated, I guess, over points of time, right? You in the Mindscape days and me doing WPF development. So I started my career as a software developer, skipped over university, just kind of went straight into the workforce when I was 18, started building software. And I did that for like 5 years consulting. And one of the big things that was happening at the time is we had this shift from like desktop apps to web applications. And we had, the emergence of continuous delivery becoming like the preeminent way to build software. And so we went from, once upon a time, we'd work on software, we'd burn it onto CDs a year later. It was sort of like the way software got developed, or it would get kind of thrown over the wall to IT to install on desktops or something, into something that we could iterate on fairly quickly and deploy to production. And you saw like the emergence of agile methodologies and all those things. So this is back in, like 2005, 2008 kind of timeframe. And the thing that kind of struck me, so I was consulting and I would go from client to client, every 3 months or so, was like the first day we would set up source control. So Hanselman has this nice pyramid. We were chatting about it on instant live messenger or something back in the day, MSN Messenger, as he drew up this pyramid. But at the bottom is like source control, right? Like, so software developer needs to make changes to code, and it needs to be safe to make those changes. And then you sort of move up that stack. So then the next is continuous integration. And so this is, your daily build, all that kind of stuff. Because the problem you had back in those days was every developer would compile stuff on their laptops, and of course it wouldn't work. And if people worked on different branches, you needed to bring those branches together, right? So the practice of continuous integration, became big. And so in the consulting days, we could set up source control, and we could set up CI, with something like Jenkins or, Draco or TeamCity or, all the products then. And then we would spend like 4 weeks figuring out how to get access to the data center to deploy something. And how to kind of automate all of that. Because once you get into deployment automation, now there's a whole area of security concerns that pile into it. You start to have to work with the IT ops team a lot more. And even today in a world of Kubernetes, it's not just like, hey, we've got this enterprise Kubernetes cluster, off you go. Everyone's got full access to that. There's a lot of thought that kind of goes into that delivery process. And so Octopus was kind of born out of that frustration, actually, of just, it should be as easy as it was to set up Git for source code, as easy as it was to set up TeamCity for my builds. I want something that I can set up to do my deployments. And so it started as a nights and weekends project. I'd done a bunch of open source projects, prior to that, and Octopus was actually going to be an open source project. But I started to realize it needs to be a system a bit like TeamCity or Azure DevOps, where teams can log into it, they can sort of multiplayer mode on this thing, set up deployment pipelines that are really optimized for doing deployments well, good documentation, good user experience, because the people doing deployments aren't necessarily engineers. And so then did it as a nights and weekends thing, and then about a year later started selling licenses for it. I was too scared at the time to require those license keys to be activated. So you could buy a license on the website, but you couldn't activate it in the product. And then at some point, we turned it into business, which we can talk about if you're interested. But that was kind of the genesis of the idea. I think just that born out of that, I need a tool that does this for myself. And I think actually the funny thing is we've hired so many people at Octopus over the years, and we asked them like why they're applying, and it's like, well, a year ago we started using Octopus, and I was so glad because it replaced the tool that I built for our organization to do this stuff, right? Like that's our competition today. Even today, it's the homegrown deployment tooling that's built around Jenkins.
We see a lot of that actually at Raygun too. Is quite often that it's not really competitors per se. It's people actually adopting a more professional approach, leveling up. We all take that path. It's not really a criticism. We start with some scripts and you kind of go from there, right? And yeah, I remember when we adopted Octopus in at Mindscape. And to your point, way back in the day, I remember our innovative push within controls, because under Mindscape we sold WPF controls and Silverlight and all of that, and we had a daily build process, and that was before the likes of Telerik and Infragistics and all that did the same thing, and that like blew people's minds because they could raise an issue, in the forum and then have a fix the next morning, and that was like, holy cow, that's right. Super impressive. And then later on, when we could I always like to find ways to operate more smoothly. We got Octopus Deploy in the mix and could start just really streamlining that pathway into production. I always like that saying, it's not the big that eats the small, it's the fast that eats the slow. So you want to
that's totally right.
Yep.
And it's funny, right? Because if you went to your competitors back then and said like, hey, what methodologies do you follow for building software? They would all say they're doing agile, but you're the only one actually shipping something. Like customers give you feedback and the next day you ship it. And that's everything. Like even if you're doing like what we used to call line of business applications inside the enterprise that are used for admins, when, Sarah from accounting walks over and complains about a bug in the thing that you've built, it makes a massive difference if you fix it the next day or you fix it a month later and it gets released a month later, because that's a month that they have to live with the pain of that bug that you haven't fixed. And then you bundle all this stuff together and, you've added 3 other features, you change some part of the UI, and yes, you fix the bug, but you introduce 2 new ones. The feedback is going to slow down. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm 100% with you. And to be honest, I've gone through the process of trying to sort of bring in Agile many years ago, and I have the opinion it's mostly bullshit. It's been co-opted by people who forget about the one that is people above the process, and so I feel like it's an absolute magnet to the middle manager type who doesn't do anything to then go and manufacture a million processes that just slow everything down. And like you say, have a problem, fix the problem, ship the fix, done. You don't need a wild ceremony for that.
I think the Agile Manifesto, if you go back to that, and if you go to the Agile Manifesto website and you click, there's like a link that takes you to like the second page of it. And they talk about a bunch of principles that underpin it. And the first one is our highest priority is to satisfy the customer through the early and continuous delivery of valuable software. And like, to me, that's Agile. Like if you're doing that, you meet the definition of Agile. Like if that truly is the highest priority of your software organization, then you're doing Agile. And if it's not, or like no matter how much you think that's the priority, if you're not doing that, but you're doing daily stand-ups, you're doing planning poke, you're doing like all the artifacts associated with people that claim to do Agile, you're not being Agile. Like that's the definition to me. Yeah.
I'm glad you and I agree on that. Like I say, a lot of these things, it's having gone through the pain of it. Tried it.
I'm sure it's the impatient founders in us as well.
Yeah,
should always be shipping something faster.
I always find that an interesting dynamic. Let's sort of click in on that, because one of the things is, and you're Australian, I'm a Kiwi, and I would like to think that our cultures, to be frank, are maybe a little bit more laid back than some of the American culture. And the CEO, the founder, does set the tempo. And I've certainly had people that kind of feel like, oh, we're trying to move too fast, and I sit there thinking, oh, we're moving too slow. And you almost have to try and find the sweet spot, right? Of like, I don't want to burn anybody out, but at the same time, I can't have 6 weeks to do one tiny piece of work. Like there's a balance in here. How do you kind of approach that a little bit in your organization?
I think the gap to try to close there is, right, like if you're, as CEO, if you're waking up thinking about like, gosh, it would be so much better if we could ship, something in this space soon because our customers are desperately asking for it. And the software team that's sort of working in that space isn't sort of waking up thinking the same thing. That's the gap to close, right? And you don't close it by kind of going and yelling at them to do it faster, and generally that's not a good way to work with people anyway, I don't think. there is this like stereotype, right? Like the stereotypical CEO is someone who should be throwing telephones at people and giving directions and making decisions. And, that's, I suspect we're both probably the opposite of that, right? Like if I have to make a decision, something's wrong. Most of the day, I'm nudging things just a little bit to the left, a little bit to the right, because most of what we're trying to do is there's obvious things we should be doing for our customers and for our business. And if we all don't kind of see those same things as being totally obvious, something's wrong because someone else has a different opinion on what the obvious thing should be. So the challenge to unpack with the team is, why don't they have the same sense of urgency towards this thing? What are they missing? And often that's like they haven't talked to the customer for a really long time. They haven't talked to the sales team for a really long time. And if you can just sort of close that gap and have them build that bit of customer empathy or sales team empathy or something like that, then actually you don't have to, like most of the teams within Octopus, I don't worry too much about the pace at which they're doing things because they're the ones waking up sort of worried about how quickly they can do it. So I get to sleep soundly at night knowing it's probably happening as fast as it could happen. And every now and then I'll go and work on a feature myself and just sort of experience, like, have we got too much process that's holding engineers back from shipping stuff or things like this, as a way to just sort of dive in and test. But generally, that's the nirvana to try to aim for, I think.
Yeah.
How about you? I'm curious how you found it.
Honestly, it's been a mix over the years, different times, different people, something that can always be improved upon. Interestingly, I feel like within particularly the Kiwi community, I'm seen as probably one of the more capitalistic and driven, I guess, technical leaders in our community. But at the same time, I don't recall a time where I've really had to ask people to say like work weekends or anything. And typically if I drive past the office and was to see the lights on and it's 6:30, I'm going in to find out why the heck people are still there, but I've always taken the view of being a bit more stringent on the idea of you go to work, you do the work, you go home. And I never fell into that trap in the ZERP eras of thinking that the entire point of the business was just to shower treats and stuff. And like, I've always found it really weird when you see people pushing like 4-day work weeks. Do I want 3 days off? Absolutely. But if your key message to people is selling them on not the work, you're selling them not on what you're there to do. And I think that we've had a lot of that sort of stuff seep into the industry over the years. And I've just kind of taken a hard line against that and kind of gone, nope, I want people who actually have a passion for doing the work and that they want to do the work while they're at work and then be cool to wrap up at the end of it.
We're very much the same. Like at Octopus, the goal is to bring together a diverse group of people who are going to be able to kind of produce things that they are really, really proud to have done, right? Like, because if you think about like, and anyone listening can do this, right? Like, describe a time that you felt most connected to your work, most enjoyment of your work. It wasn't because they had a foosball table. It wasn't because, there might be more to do with the connection with the people that you're working with. But, if you've ever tried to like join like a sporting club or something and you have someone who's like, they're there for the social, but they're not there to kind of improve at the activity that we're all here for. Like, we're all trying to run and you're not really running, or we're all trying to cycle and you're holding the group back. And it's clear like the attitude just kind of isn't right. That creates like this really toxic environment where the only thing left, because the joy of doing the work has kind of been taken out of it, right, is maybe the perks. But we're very much the same. We sort of talked in the early days about like, we don't want Octopus to be a place that's like daycare for adults. It's a place where if you want to come and self-actualize and feel really proud of the contribution you make to society and your craft and just the enjoyment that comes with that, like, we want to be that workplace. And what's cool about that, like what's actually unique about our cultures, I think, is that when you do that, you also create this environment where it's not up to the manager to kind of pull people aside and say, hey, you're not doing a very good job, or your attitude isn't allowing the team to progress. The team does it because the team is so motivated to deliver things. And like, they're listening to the customers, they're hearing the feedback, they're seeing the chance to kind of self-actualize by making the product better, that, they're kind of the ones spotting team members who aren't. They're often doing a lot of the initial conversations. It works really well.
I do share that. One of the things, back on your point about how do you interact with the team, I really like to to actually build a relationship with everybody. Really, I'm quite a, I think, social person overall, and that kind of means that by default, I have a pretty good idea of what everybody's kind of doing at any one point. And one of the things that I try to coach a little bit on, which supports what you're saying, is it is far better for the peer group to hold people accountable than for accountability to actually be driven top down. So if I go and talk to somebody about not performing, it has a very different tone to it when the CEO comes to you and says, hey, this is not flying, versus a colleague kind of saying, hey man, I'm noticing that you're not getting this done. Is there anything I can help out on? It's a better mechanism for driving good behaviors, because it doesn't feel so heavy-handed. And the thing I struggle with sometimes is like, I don't intend it to be heavy-handed.
Yeah.
It's the nature of the role.
Do you find too, like sometimes you're in one-to-ones with people and like they're spotting that someone on their team isn't doing a very good job, but they're a bit not sure what to do about it. And so they'll come to you and they'll say like, hey, here's kind of the situation, here's the issue, here's what the person needs to do. And you sort of sit there and think like, everything you just said is just the thing you need to say to that person. You don't need to say it to me, because if I go and do it, I'm kind of rescuing you from this situation. And actually, if you were to reverse the situation around, if they had that feedback for you, I suspect you would much prefer to hear it from them than you would for them to tell me and for you to hear it from me. And so, but then you can often do a bit of coaching around, unpacking like what's the reason for it. It might be something about their relationship that's kind of preventing them from giving the feedback they need to give, or you can kind of coach through some of those things. But in an ideal world, and by and large, most issues should get resolved that way.
Yeah, I share that view. I think trying to create a culture where people can just be honest, and therefore there's an element of need to be a bit understanding, I guess. If you hear something you think actually that doesn't quite feel right, it's like, well, actually, what was the key message? Like maybe we don't overly focus on it being a huge negative. Well, this kind of, we've been really interesting on these questions, but let's loop this back slightly into the developer to business guy, because a lot of what we've just covered, are things that we would have had to have adjusted. So one of my questions I was going to ask you is, what was the biggest mental shift in kind of going, hey, I write these cool tools for open source and I put them on my blog, to, I'm a business leader in Australia, and what was the mental wiring? What were some of the lessons you learned, or mistakes you maybe made and thought, oh gosh,
that's not. It's not. It's not in the appendix of the developer docs, is it? how to work with people. So it was slowly and steadily, right? So around 2010, I started shipping the first versions of Octopus and had it on my blog. People started following it. They got, I think, really excited about the problem space I was working in, and they started downloading it and giving feedback. And then around 2012, I was living in London at the time, so I grew up in a small country town in South Australia. Actually, around 17, 18, taught myself to code, just got so interested in software as a way of sort of expressing yourself and building things. It's the sort of unlimited Lego set is the way I think about it, right? Like, as long as I have a computer and enough coffee or something to keep me awake, I can write as much software or as little as I like. There's no raw ingredients. I don't have to buy steel or something to develop software, and that's incredible. So I got really interested in that. And I also got really interested in following like a lot of the early kind of blogs around building these small software businesses. So like Joel Spolsky's early blog on Joel and Software when he was doing Fog Creek, or Eric Sink he did like his micro ISV experiment building like a solitaire game. And I always, I guess, found myself just really drawn to the idea of building a small software business that would employ 2 or 3 people. We can build some really cool code together. We can ship it and have lots of customers, but not be at the mercy of the sort of any single customer. And so the popularity of Octopus kind of started to feel like it could actually be the chance to do that and kind of move out of the consulting world. So in 2012, I moved back from London. I'd been living in London, consulting there for a couple of years. Moved back from London, came back to Brisbane, and we had this, I guess, I'd met Sonia kind of around 2010 as well. We were dating, we got engaged, and decided to get married. So I moved back to Brisbane, where Sonia lived, and we sort of had that choice of like, okay, I can go and get another consulting job, or actually try and turn this thing into a business. And like I said, people could buy licenses, but there was no place to actually put the serial in the product, because I thought if we do that, I'll get less people using it, I'll get less feedback, I won't be able to make better software. But around October 2012, we changed it so at some point you did have to put a license key in after like a trial, and immediately it started making like $10,000 a month for the first couple of months. And now that's like, when I say immediate, I mean it was like 2 years of working on it as a nights and weekends thing, and all the work that went into that. But and so from that point, Sonia started working in the business too, sort of doing the accounts, all the finance side of it, while I kind of wrote the software and answered the support tickets. And then, from 2012 to 2014, it was just us working on it, building it up. We started hiring people in 2014. Now with 320 people, $75 million in revenue at the end of this year. So slow and steadily growing it. Yeah.
So you're going to go back to consultancy?
No, probably not. The challenge with consulting is, I think you get exposed to this really interesting wide range of problems, but you don't really get to take ownership of them in the way that you do when you're building a product. Product development is, if you're a software engineer, I saw this thing once that in the accounting world, you're either on the sort of asset or revenue side of the business, or you're on the sort of liability expense side of the business. And in the consulting world, you're on the expense side, right? Like, but when you're working on a product, you're on the asset side, you're on the revenue side, and it's just so much fun. Yeah.
That was a huge driver for JB and I to start Mindscape originally. So we had been in a consultancy as well, and the thing that used to drive me up the wall, and to be super clear, I knew I wanted to build a software company since I was like 10 years old. So like this wasn't on my mind. But what used to drive me up the wall was that we would sort of go, okay, we're going to build this piece of software. It's going to take this amount of time and it's going to take this much money. And you'd kind of get it complete, and you would realize that if you had maybe like even a few more days, you could make this thing about twice as good for what the customer needs. But there's no budget, so stop, tools down. That's our margin, like we can't spill this. And you'd be like, yes. but it's not as good as it could be, we could take this further. And I actually just grew to really dislike that, where I was like, actually, as an engineer, I want to polish this a little bit more and make it better. And so I kind of saw the only real path to doing that was to build a product, because now there's an incentive, if it's making money, to kind of keep investing in it yourself. And I really love that. We've now got a range of products. It took me a few years, but I would say the one thing that I missed, I guess, a little bit from consultancy was that you did kind of get an insight into so many different types of businesses or government departments and things, and you actually kind of learned the domain of a lot of different categories of business. And that kind of fed just a general curiosity. So I missed that slightly, but I kind of have replaced it nowadays with just going and visiting customers all over the world and hearing about how they're using us within their business, and then hearing about, how do you stream all these things? How do you make that many pieces? It's quite interesting. But yeah.
You touched on something really important there, though, which I think is like that motivation that any kind of craftsperson has, where like the quality of what you're capable of producing, right? Like given sort of unlimited time and budget, what you can produce. And so you're sort of at your happiest when you're approaching that, but when you have to kind of really stop short, it's hard to then be really proud, like really intrinsically proud of the work you've done. And so then the reward of actually doing that work kind of really goes away. With our teams, we try and create that urgency that's driven by like the customer empathy. Like customers have this problem and we want to solve it, and we want to solve it sort of as quickly as we can, but there's no focus on sort of deadlines for delivering stuff for exactly that reason. We know that the team are going to be so much more motivated if they can kind of do the work at the quality they know they're capable of doing.
Yeah, I've found, and this sort of also plugs into the whole agile thing and all of that. And look, maybe I'll go back on this, in a couple of years. One of the things I've actually found quite effective in a product company is actually just to lay down a deadline, but the deadline is totally movable. The reason I find that useful, and actually to even pass it top down, not let the team pick it, is because I don't see it as the drop dead date for shipping. I see it as you need to understand this to help you figure out how many things you have to say no to in order to, like, it's just a constraint.
Yes.
And I think as a software developer, you initially start in your experience with feeling like constraints are a bad thing. And then you realize the more constraints, the better, because it simply zeroes you in on what actually matters.
Yes. Yeah, we found actually an interesting one where we do a lot of events where we go and exhibit at them through the year. And so like we were just at KubeCon in North America in Salt Lake City in November. And, that was a great experience for all the teams because, we knew we were doing it sort of 12 months out and we could sort of say like, okay, by KubeCon, you want to be in a position where you can show this sort of area of functionality that you're working on in the very best possible light. Like, let's turn up to that and be sort of as proud as we can of what we've produced, ready to show it off. Again, like really driven by what the team wants to achieve in that and a little bit of nudging from us. And it is really powerful because it does, like you said, it sort of shrinks like, okay, I don't need to worry about that. I don't need to worry about this, but I'm going to really focus on this because this is the thing that matters.
Yeah. Yep. And it's taken a little bit of time though. It's kind of goes back to this sort of management to engineer trust level, so an example of something that I've tried to do at Raygun is we might say, hey, we want to ship something by this date, use that to make a bunch of decisions about it. But inevitably there's kind of, I wouldn't go so far as to say technical debt, but there's the shortcuts that people make, to try and get there. And they think, I'll go back to this, I'll tidy this up. And in most places you don't, they just end up sitting there. I've tried really hard in recent years to kind of make sure I give that space at the end to say, cool, we shipped it. Now take a few days to actually just like pack it down, tidy it up, make sure everything's how you actually wanted it. Because again, that freedom in a product business, and look, let's be really fair here as well. Like Octopus is doing phenomenally well. Raygun's a cash flow positive business too, so it actually affords a lot of flexibility that maybe some people don't have. So want to understand that point, but actually giving that time to do things, to give people that space. So once they get that confidence that the deadline doesn't hit and they have to just down tools and walk away, they kind of can also split out, oh no, I can afford to tidy that up for a few days afterwards.
Yeah.
And that kind of shows that trust being handed down, to say, I understand that. I sometimes think that might be something that maybe only really happens if you do have a technical leader in the organization. I'm not sure that a non-engineer would fully appreciate why we do that or could do that.
Yeah, I think that's right. Because I think most software development is kind of weird in that it's almost more of a creative pursuit than it is a sort of engineering pursuit. Like it's weird. We've got sales and marketing teams, and you sort of think like, well, my software engineers are kind of really logic driven and really engineers, and my marketing and sales, it's all really fluffy and people relationships and stuff. But actually, like, I can measure my sales team way more effectively than I can measure my software team, and I could do the same in marketing. So then the challenge becomes like, well, how do I measure my software team? And the best kind of place we've ended up on is if I look holistically at the product we had a week ago and the product we have today, do I feel like we made progress? And do I feel like we sort of made as much progress as I think we possibly could have made? And as long as the answer is yes, and that's weird because you're not measuring it based on a forward, like a plan that you had made about where you were going to be, right? Like a year ago, we thought we'd have shipped this thing and we haven't. You actually just focus it on like a week ago, we hadn't shipped this thing and now we have.
Yes.
Or a week ago, it didn't do this and now it does. And as long as it's making forward progress, I think that's actually the only thing you can, and you measure it by feel. You don't measure it by numbers or reports, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I tend to share that view. One of the things we don't actually run like a sales team at Raygun. We do have a customer success function, and we tend to do sort of people try the product, they like it, they pay for it, and then they typically will grow with us over time, which is really cool. But I remember when we did a few years back, I tried building a sales team in sort of 2016, 2017 out of the US. And because we were engineering heavy, I would try to sort of build that empathy because I don't think a lot of software developers actually can empathize with the fact that a lot of those functions are walking around with a number above their head that basically says, am I winning or am I losing? And that is a thing developers don't even understand. And, last decade, everybody loves to talk about empathy, and I take the view that experience eats empathy for breakfast. You can pretend all you want, you know what it feels like, but you don't until you do. So therefore, I don't think the developers actually empathize well with how that can feel when there is actually a number. You can literally open your home screen up and decide if you're a winner or a loser that day. But to your point, you've got to have that feel for, are we actually executing well? Back to what you were saying earlier about optimization, one of the things that I'm loving at Raygun at the moment is the team themselves are really focused on, like, what are the things in our process that are eating up cycle time, and they're the ones trying to remove those because they just want to go faster. And then obviously the only real involvement from the leadership side is to kind of say, how much time do we allocate to kind of doing those sorts of projects to speed up the team? But the fact that it's coming bottom up is just awesome to see. That's that sort of logic. You see that behavior and you're like, I got the right people.
It's the right people, and and you've empowered them to kind of, like you said, they're waking up thinking about that, so you don't have to. Like, you can worry about other stuff, which is really nice. I don't know if I've sort of answered you. I think what was your original question though around like that transition from, so like I was a software developer. I saw myself as a software developer in starting Octopus, and I thought the enjoyable thing out of it would be, we build a business, we make enough profit that we can hire a handful of people from it, and then we'll just sort of have fun building something we're really proud of. That was the goal, and it wasn't supposed to be big. And over the years it grew. So, we've grown every year for the last decade. We've grown by, the smallest amount is like 20%. Usually it's kind of in the 30 to 50% range every single year. And we've done that profitably sort of 10 out of the last 11 years. And through that, like at some point, the company got really big, and, well, to me, really big. And so, it gets to like 80 people, and you think like, this is asking things from me that I'm just totally out of my depth on, right? Because like I know how to develop software, and I know how to answer a support ticket because I care about the customer, and there's things I know how to do. And then there's all these things that we have to figure out how to do well to kind of keep it growing. And there's a decision you make, which is like, how much do you want it to kind of keep growing? And actually, like, there is a power, there's this sort of idea that sort of businesses sort of grow or they die. I think there is some truth to it, because when a business is growing, it means it can afford to hire more people. And in hiring more people, you create opportunities for people to progress their careers. They move into management, that kind of thing. or they become, there's a certain amount of career growth that can happen in a company that's not growing, but at some point there are people who will outgrow the company. And then as good people outgrow the company, you lose those good people. And the whole thing of a company is like being in the company of good people. It's the sort of irreplaceable part of what makes the company. And so there is a value in, if it can grow, sort of enabling that to continue. And I definitely reached a point in 2016 or so. So around 2016, I stopped coding on the product full time. Mm-hmm. I still, even at the start of this year, I kind of went and spent a week working on something. So I can still do it. Now it's React, and I can kind of learn React, and I can build some features and stuff. But generally, like it's too hard to kind of work on like a whole feature and code myself these days. So stopped doing that around 2016, started actually probably around 2018, really shifting my focus towards the sales and marketing aspects of Octopus, the things that we sort of weren't doing so well. And I found so much enjoyment in that, because in the same way that you sort of can feel really proud about a product that you're building or a software team that you're building, you can feel really proud when your marketing team goes from everything that they produced in the last week, I feel embarrassed to put on the website, to everything that they put on the website themselves this week is at such high quality, I wouldn't change any of it. That's amazing. And it's the same on the sales team. When you go from, I'm really embarrassed that we just had that call with that customer because, it was clear the salesperson's motivation wasn't good, through to like, my salespeople are my most pro-customer people, and they're providing amazing feedback to the product, and they really are treating the customer with all the care and respect that they deserve. And they're having really intelligent conversations around how we can help the customer's business be better. Like, again, you can feel so proud of the thing that you're building through that. And so I found a lot of pleasure, I guess, in doing that. I also hit, I guess, a bit of a limit. There was definitely some points where I thought, I probably need to hire someone else to be the CEO, because we're getting to like 100 people or so. And my consulting time, I managed 5 people or something once upon a time. Right now, I'm completely out of my depth. And so I got a coach. His name is Simon Brown. He's based in the UK. And we started working together from, I think, around 2018 or so. And we still work together today. And, every couple of weeks I can sit down with him and just kind of dump out the problems on my mind, the thing I'm dealing with. And, I definitely found, like, for me, people issues were always the thing that would keep me up. It was never kind of competitors or customer issues so much, because the team took care of those. It was always this like, I've hired this person and the fit is wrong, and I'm not sure what I should do about it. And those are the sort of darkest moments. And so having someone that you can kind of share that with and just sort of make some progress on and improve on it has been really beneficial. I'm here for as long as I feel like I'm the right CEO for the business, and then I won't be when I'm not. But I'm enjoying it a lot.
From my side on that, I probably almost a similar time. I think I teamed up with Mary just before I went to Seattle, so maybe 2015. And just being able to have that third party full trust, they're kind of arm's length enough that it's not really that they understand what's actually going on inside the shop. So you're talking much more almost clinically, if it makes sense. There's not as much emotion in it, from their side anyway. As you say, sometimes you just sit there and like, oh my God. And like, I don't say this as a pat on the back, but I think one of the things that can be quite difficult when you're actually leading the organization is that if you're doing your job well, most people don't realize how much bullshit you're actually like dealing with. And and they can be things that are inside the shop and no one is aware that it's going on, like, other than you. And that can be quite, I used to not take the view that it was lonely to be the CEO. And last few years, I've kind of gone, no, you kind of do sit there sometimes being like, well, no one else is going to solve this problem. Like, and that's not a criticism of other people. It's more like, no, this is actually my problem to solve. And that was something Mary used to always say, is like, what are you actually responsible for to ensure that you're only taking on the things that only you can do? And if other people can do them, kick them away. I'm a bit of a control freak, so the delegation side is probably one of my weaker points. But yeah. But your point about, maybe somebody else should be CEO, I'm pretty sure that goes through every CEO's head about twice a day.
It's healthy. You're right though. Like it's every job is a bit lonely, right? Like if I think of my head of engineering, there's problems he deals with that, he can come to me, but I'm probably not going to have super relevant ideas on it, because I've never been a head of engineering for 150 engineers. Like that's something he's going to have to kind of figure out. And actually, that's maybe the one exception is, like, if you think of everyone else on the team, they all have sort of a defined job, and ideally, most people kind of see the bigger thing to be solved, and they do stuff that's kind of outside of that sort of pathway for them. But there's a class of things that your business isn't doing well today that your customer needs from you, that, like, from Raygun or from Octopus, which is your problem. Like, it's your problem, it's my problem, but it doesn't actually fall to anyone else on the team to solve. And there's stuff that they just sort of can't solve because it's cultural, or there's other things that just kind of require CEO leadership. And there's no getting around those things. And they're hard. They can be really hard problems because you can't often even talk to them with the other folks that you're working with, right? Because they're part of the issue, or whatever. You can't talk to your board about it either often. Other CEOs are a really great outlet. So because you and I chatting every now and then, and just you just talk about the things you're dealing with, and you realize, actually, it's just so much reassuring to know you have that problem too. Now I don't have to worry about, like, is it me? Am I the thing? I could just focus on just solving the problem. So that's always really nice. And that's the same, I think, for my head of engineering. So the challenge for him is, like, how does he become? He's a really great head of engineering for 150 engineers. How does he become one for 250 engineers as we grow? I can't offer him any advice on that, but he can find other peers who are doing that kind of role at that scale, and he can learn from them. And, yeah.
Cool. And so one of the things that's early on, I want to sort of pick on this a little bit. We've talked a lot about CEOing in these companies, but you talked about how you built Octopus sort of in the weekends and nights. So, effectively a side project. And then you made that comment about not putting the licensing box in, and not putting a price on it. And I'll give a few thoughts for a second on this, which is firstly, I think software engineers have a really weird relationship with money. They are really afraid to charge money. They often don't realize that they're some of the highest paid people in society either. They live in this really warped bubble where they don't want to spend any money, but they want to be really expensive themselves. And then they're afraid to charge for their services, and I make this joke, look, I love open source, but I'm convinced open source is actually simply a symptom of that developer mindset where we are grinding through an incredibly slow version of watching software developers reinvent capitalism, because it's like, how do I get money for this thing I built? And it's like, this is a solved problem, guys. You don't really need to figure out a whole new system. But you obviously had a little bit of fear of putting that pricing thing in. I've seen it as a barrier, even in companies I've angel invested in, where I actually end up getting quite pushy about put in the goddamn credit card form, how did you overcome that? What was some of the, because I think it's just a natural fear. What if they don't like my baby, so I'll just put it out there for free.
Well, I think it's probably that. I think there's also this idea that if it's free, more people will use it, which is, I think, actually true to your point. Yep. There's also, I think, like, if you think about how software is developed, right? So here's the question: is software developed and like kind of conceived in the author's head, and then it's kind of built and shipped, or is it sort of created in a much more iterative fashion where? So I kind of think of it as like that first version of something that you ship. The first version of Octopus I shipped was the start of a conversation with the industry about what needed to be done to solve this problem. So I started the conversation by shipping something, and then I got feedback. And then I responded, to that conversation by shipping something else. And it's that ongoing dialogue with customers, with people using it, with people not using it. Why aren't they using it? Why haven't they trialed it? That sort of like hammers and hones the software from the sort of raw idea, which isn't very good, into something that, hopefully lots of people want to use. And so I saw some value in the early days, I think, of not charging for it, precisely just to get that feedback, because the feedback would lead to improving it. I share your view though. Like, I think we have, and it comes back to that point at the start of like, there's no raw ingredients required in the act of producing software. And so therefore the price of software can range anything from incredibly expensive Oracle databases right down to zero, and it's free and open source. And so of course you see everything in that range. And I think in the early days of open source, that was generally a good thing, because you had users of computers who were thinking, gosh, it would be really nice if my computer could do this thing. It's really cool that someone over there at a different company solved that problem. I shall solve it too, right? In the same way accountants might share with each other the type of spreadsheet they use for doing some kind of model or something, right? But now today, like, the whole thing is flipped. And I sort of think, like, if you were a Richard Stallman or someone, you'd almost sort of be shocked by how much the sort of industrial big tech software has co-opted open source and turned it from a thing that was being used against them to a thing that they can kind of clob everybody else with, right? So if you look at like all open source software that's being used today, almost all open source software falls into the category of it's being done by a giant advertising company as a way to make it cool to work there. So for example, Facebook makes React, and everybody uses React, and so everyone thinks working at Facebook must be really cool. But what does it mean to work at Facebook? Well, it means, you're setting up advertising platforms to convince old grandmas to spend money on stuff they don't need, or to, lose elections, or, whatever it is, right? Yep. So there's that aspect of it, and then there's the other aspect, which is like, you take Kubernetes is like such a great example. So you go from virtual machines kind of get invented, and companies like VMware get produced, to like the big cloud vendors being worried that the same thing is going to happen with containers. Docker raises a whole bunch of venture funding, makes, Docker is open source, and so everyone uses it because it's open source and free. They get worried. Docker's path to kind of paying for all of that development effort, because they had like 300 employees, is to start charging for Docker Enterprise. The big cloud vendors look at that and think, well, we don't want Docker Enterprise to become the next VMware, so we'll create Kubernetes. And sort of now, like, that I think gets into the world of dumping, where it's effectively like, in the whole thing with like Chinese steel manufacturers selling steel for less than it costs to produce to wipe out local steel industries so that there's no one less to compete with, and then they can ratchet up pricing, right? Like it's illegal in every other part of the economy, but these big tech companies can sort of open source things and effectively dump onto the market as zero cost software that gets used. What I don't think software developers realize it creates, though, is a world where your only choice, because like you said, most software engineers are actually in the sort of 1%. They don't realize it, but they are. And not just globally, but generally within the country that they live in. And they need money just like everyone else to live and survive on. And ideally, they'd be paid for the work that they do. They generally expect to be paid. And so, but what's left is like, if you take that to the extreme, like if you want to become a software engineer, you're basically going to have to work for big tech because they're the only ones who can afford to keep dumping software on the market. Or you can work for a venture-backed company that's doing a bunch of open source to get traction, but will eventually run out of money and not find any path to commercialization. Or you can work for like one of the big advertising giants and do software that you're actually not really proud of. That's like going back to when I started, this idea of like, I'm going to make some cool software that people will find valuable. In exchange for that value, they'll pay me some amount of money that's less than the value they're getting for it. And I shall use that money to hire software engineers. And it creates a really virtuous cycle of like reinvestment in making the product better. I personally think that's a much better way to actually produce software, but it's kind of I don't know, we might be the last of the ISVs.
I 100% agree with you with everything you just said. We might have to take it to the after hours whiskey session, but because take the VC category, and I won't name them, but like we have a competitor. They've raised more than $300 million US. They're open core. We're cash flow positive and haven't really raised a lot of money at all. Like we've raised less than $2 million US in our history. And I kind of look at it and I think a lot of modern VC, particularly when it plays into open source, it's actually how can a startup behave as nefariously as an antitrust player, which is basically, let's not worry about how the hell we're going to make money. Let's just basically salt the earth in the space so that we can jack the prices once we've taken out everybody because they can't compete with quote unquote free. And we've just seen that bait and switch over and over. And to be honest, like I used to be a bigger fan of Y Combinator, but I kind of see a little bit of like their pathway, their sort of recipe now is pretty much repeat that over and over and over again. And to a degree, I've sort of felt like, by building a company that actually puts money in the bank kind of makes you a little bit invulnerable to it, which is nice because you can kind of steer your own destiny, but you're bang on. It's like, what I think we've overdone the, if the product is free, you're the product. But if the product is free, you should seriously question, like, why do they think the value is zero? Like why do they?
And it's so weird because most software engineers work for companies who are presumably paying them to produce some software to solve a business problem. And so if buying some software helps you solve that problem a little bit faster, that's actually what the business wants you to do. They may not really understand why you want to buy it. And that's where just adopting something that's open source might be easier. But I think that has to do more with sort of software developers' reluctance maybe to just sort of understand the wider business that they work in. There's this sort of focus on the craft, not on the business that they contribute to. That maybe is the challenge there. I think VC has definitely had another warping effect. I think open source is one, not so much open source as originally envisaged. Like you and I are both dealing with the same problem. Maybe we make some open source software and share it between ourselves to solve that same problem because it's not directly related to our business. But when you've got the large tech vendors using open source as a weapon to kind of control the economics of how money flows within the software ecosystem, I think that's really different. And people don't realize like the reason everyone uses Kubernetes is because of the marketing budget that Microsoft and so on put around it. It's got nothing to do with like technically what it is. Now that marketing contribution translates into more people using it, more people contributing to it. And so it does have that effect. But VC, like the weird thing with VC, if you go back to like how Silicon Valley started, it was funding like processor design and all this stuff that actually really is capital intensive. Like if my business plan is build giant factory and then over 20 years produce enough widgets from that factory that I make my money back, like of course I need to raise money for that. It's capital intensive. Software is not. Like, software is you and me know how to code, and if you don't know how to code, you can watch enough YouTube videos these days to learn how. And we just put time, right? We need the capital requirements are ramen noodles or something for that couple of years, and we produce and we sell the software, and there's no raw ingredients needed. So there's nothing about software that's capital intensive in nature. What is capital intensive sometimes can be the sales and marketing effort required to force it down the throats of people who don't quite see the value in the product yet. So when we try and do that in a sort of like almost like pumping hormones into the software to get it to be used by lots of people. And from now, because software has zero cost, there's this idea that like we can build the software. In theory, what you should be able to do is take a company like Octopus, fire all the software engineers, have the product, continue to sell the product to all of the customers, pay very little for sales and marketing to kind of keep that flywheel going, and effectively produce infinite profits because it's the marginal cost of each unit sold is so low. Yep. So that's why venture capital is like attracted to it. In reality, that never happens. That's why everyone was interested in Elon Musk with Twitter. Do I really need so many software engineers just to maintain something that's not really changing that much? But I think given the choice between acquiring some software or acquiring the team that produced the software, the team is actually the valuable thing, which I think it takes everyone a while to realize. But yeah, because of that, VC's had a big distortionate effect as well. I think maybe it's hopefully fading out, but we'll see.
Yeah, I think back to your point on the Twitter changes, they actually tie into what you were saying earlier, which is I don't think it was so much that it was a reduction in force by 80% as much as it was making sure that the remaining 20% were the people that wake up thinking about the right things in that business, and that therefore they could have a smaller core if that was how you thought, and that's the only way that would have worked in a reduction. If everybody there was actually a heavy hitter knocking it out of the park and really essentially everything, it would have fallen over. I think it was a bit more of an indictment on the nature of modern software teams than it was necessarily about, just cutting heads for cutting heads' sake.
I think there's this weird thing so this challenge that software businesses have where, like, again, because there's no marginal cost of the things we're producing. So I don't know if people are interested in this, but if you think about like the Octopus budgeting cycle every year, right? So what we do is we say, we think next year we're going to grow by like 30%, something like that. So what's going to happen is, today we have this much revenue and we have this much expenses. And next year we sort of know we're going to grow. So we're going to have this much revenue. What do we want to do about the expenses? So one option is we keep the expenses completely flat. We don't hire anybody else. And what's going to happen is then we'll generate all this cash, and that cash will be classed as profit. We'll have to pay taxes on it. And so half of it will disappear in taxes. And then of the half that's left, it's just going to kind of sit in our bank account and we're not going to do anything with it. And now then you sort of say, well, if I had a bunch of money left around, what would I do? And I'm certain if I go and ask my software team what they would do, they would say, go and hire more software engineers to make even better software, right? Mm-hmm. And in fact, if I asked my customers what I should do with that extra cash, they would also say the same thing. They would say, well, there's this bug we've been talking to you about for 6 months. Can you do something about that? And so there is a pressure to kind of reinvest in making the business better. And of course, there's competitive pressures and so on. So that's kind of like the beginning of the budget process. Then the question is, okay, what do I spend it on? So, for us, we think about like, okay, well, to grow, we're going to probably need to have a few more people selling and a few more marketers and so on. So there's those costs. With that comes sort of extra people that we have to hire. And so we probably need some extra HR people or finance people to kind of support it, right? So it's sort of like sales and marketing, then the G&A. All the cash that's left, effectively then the choice is again sit on it or invest it in making the software better. And so every year it's like, okay, well, we can hire 30 more software engineers this year, but what are they going to work on? The question we've never kind of been able to figure out is like, when does that sort of stop being effective, right? Like we've got one product effectively, maybe you could split it into kind of two major code bases, and 150 people working on it. At what point do we spend all day just in merge conflicts? Like there's just too many engineers working on the one thing. I think if you get to like the Twitter scale, so that thing continues, right? Like every year we can afford to hire more software engineers, so we do. But the question is, does Twitter actually really need it? That's actually a really hard thing, I think. And I think that's why you see every software company works this way. We just hire more software engineers, more software engineers. Xero, they're in your neck of the woods, right? I think they have something like 2,000 software engineers. I'm a Xero user. I've been using it for a really long time. The product hasn't changed for like 10 years. I don't see what any of those people are working on. There's bugs that have been open for so long. but 2,000 engineers, what do they do?
Not
I can't
much.
fathom it.
That's the
That's my
answer.
sense. That's my sense.
I mean, I
But
don't like to
that
cast aspersions, but like there are like it's sad. I could not hold
well,
my head high if I was an engineer and said this thing looks exactly like it did a decade ago, and it has all
yeah.
the same bugs. It's like, what the hell are you doing?
And I don't know that as an industry we even know how to scale this thing past really maybe 100 engineers working on one sort of thing, one code base
Yeah.
at one
I'm
time.
actually with you. I think that one of the big mistakes that has really infected through ZIRP, is we are scaling product companies as though they are services companies.
Yeah,
Why are we adding in all these people? If WhatsApp and Instagram are 20, 50 people, and they're multi-billion-dollar companies supporting billions of users, kind of like, what's your excuse? It's like,
yeah,
now, to be fair, talent is not evenly distributed, so there is challenges there. But yeah, I'm with you. I rather this kind of goes back to the craftsmanship, right? I want to get stuff out the door. The things have to go out. We've just completed our 12 days. It kind of annoyed me, Sam Altman saying, like, as far as we're aware, we're the only tech company that's ever done a 12 days of Christmas. And we were already on like day 5. And then he said, we stopped for weekends and we kept shipping in the weekend. They were obviously ready to go. But it's like we ended up shipping 13 feature improvements in 13 days for people. And it's just like, it's kind of like what you were talking about. Success begets success. It's like the 4-minute mile. If other people can see people moving at velocity, it almost gives them permission to believe it's possible. And then they
yes.
do the same. And the more stuff that comes in, the slower it gets. Hey, Paul, I would love this conversation to kind of go on for about another 6-7 hours. But I'm getting the signals that we need to be wrapping up. So I reckon we should do another part 2 at some point. This has been really interesting to kind of look at. And I feel like we've barely scratched the surface of both transitioning from developer to CEO, as well as scaling, how we think about software economics. I actually think your points there on open source from big tech are really insightful to share with the audience. If people do want to keep up with what Paul Stovell's got going on, do you still run your blog? Ever since the RSS readers died, I've kind of fallen off it, but I used to love
Yeah.
reading.
I write kind of 1 or 2 a year. That's kind of it at the moment.
Yep.
I'm on LinkedIn a little bit, but yeah, not being super active, too busy internally
It's almost
focused.
like you got a business to run. Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I got a bunch of hobbies too. I'm restoring a car at the moment. That's keeping me busy.
Oh, that's cool. That's cool. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Paul. And thank you to everybody who has listened and to today's podcast. If there are any questions you'd like to send, we haven't done this one live, but please send them through to us. We're happy. We might use that to tee up a second session with you, Paul. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.